Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and in this video I'm going to tell you about the books that I've been reading this third week of Victober. I cannot believe that we're actually heading into the last week of October and the last week of Victober. I have been loving what I have been reading, some certainly more than others, but it has been a really great month for Victorian literature, Victorian historical mysteries, and even some non-fiction. So let's just delve right in. I'm going to start with the book that I finished, and this is called A Knife in the Fog by Bradley Harper. It is a historical mystery set in 1888, and he wrote this just a couple of years ago. I mentioned this book in a previous video, so I won't delve into too much detail, but the main character is Conan Doyle, and he gets contacted by someone who works for the Prime Minister, who works for Gladstone, asking him if he will come to London and look at some of the evidence in the Jack the Ripper killings, the Whitechapel murders, and see if he can give the police any help, if he can like kind of guide lines of inquiry and stuff like that. And so he says yes, he'll do it, but only if he can bring along his Professor Joseph Bell from Scotland. And Joseph Bell, of course, is the man that he kind of based Sherlock Holmes on. That's where he learned the art of observation like that kind of Sherlock Holmes is famous for. We also meet Margaret Harkness, who is an author who lives in the East End. So all of these people are like actual historical people, which I thought was interesting. And there were plenty more in this book too. And so in the end, I gave this 3.5 stars. I liked it, but I thought he obviously did a lot of research into this story, which was great, but sometimes he put too much of that research into the story, if you know what I mean. But otherwise, it was a great historical mystery, good characters, entertaining. Yeah, 3.5 stars. I've also been continuing to read Detection by Gaslight. This collection is edited by Douglas G. Greene. And one thing I've discovered as I've been reading through these stories is that there were far more female detectives in the Victorian era, being written about in the Victorian era, than I would have expected. And not all of them were being written by women, which I thought was very interesting. All right, this week I read The Haverstock Hill Murder by George R. Sims. George R. Sims, as it says in the description, was a London journalist, novelist, and short story writer, many of whose works sympathize with the conditions of London's poor, though perhaps not quite as consistently as Arthur Morrison's Tales of Mean Streets. Beginning in 1889, most of Sims' short story collections contained detective or crime stories, but his most important work was a series of tales published in 2 volumes called Dorcas Dean Detective, Her Adventures. And these came out 1897 to 1898. Except for having probably the least euphonious name in mystery fiction, Dorcas Dean is one of the most interesting sleuths of the period. So euphonious just means like pleasant sounding or agreeable to the ear, and so this guy doesn't think that Dorcas Dean sounds very pleasant, and I guess he's right, like it's kind of really harsh and abrupt, Dorcas Dean. Anyways, but she is an interesting sleuth. Born Dorcas Lester, she became an actress but retired from the stage to marry Paul Dean, an artist. After her husband became blind, she used her acting ability to become a professional detective. Like so many detective stories of this period, her cases are narrated by a friend, in this instance an old-fashioned humdrum family solicitor, for whom she can do no wrong. And so, like a lot of these detective stories from Victorian times, it's narrated in the first person by someone other than the detective. And the Haverstock Hill Murder was really good. I really enjoyed it. And then I also read a short story by L.T. Mead and Robert Eustace called Mr. Bovees' Unexpected Will, which was also very entertaining. So L.T. Mead, she was a very successful writer of books for teenaged girls, and then she also wrote some mysteries, and she collaborated with Robert Eustace, who provided the scientific elements in her stories, helped her with those. Mr. Bovees' Unexpected Will appeared in the Harmsworth magazine in 1898. It is one of the few Mead stories never to appear in one of her books, and it is the first of a 4-story series about Florence Cusack. And so Florence Cusack was a really interesting person. She's described here in the story as a young and handsome woman. She possessed to all appearance superabundant health. Her energies were extraordinary and her life completely out of the common. She lived alone in a large house in Kensington Court Gardens, kept a good staff of servants, and went much into society. Her beauty, her sprightliness, her wealth, and above all, her extraordinary life caused her to be much talked about. As one glanced at this handsome girl with her slender figure, her eyes of the darkest blue, her raven black hair and clear complexion, it was almost impossible to believe that she was a power in the police courts and highly respected by every detective in Scotland Yard. High praise indeed for our Florence Cusack. So in this story, she's looking into a case that involves a Mr. Bovee. And in Mr. Bovees' will, he says that there are 3 claimants to what is in his safe, the money that is in his safe. But in order to decide which one gets that money, it's whoever weighs the closest to what the money in his safe weighs gets it. Which is weird. Like, what a bizarre condition in a will. But that was a really good story too. That one was really interesting. And then I read A Perverted Genius by Silas K. Hawking. He is an ordained United Methodist minister and was at one time the best-selling novelist in England. And his 50 novels were published and republished in matching sets. In 1903, his publishers claimed that over 1 million of his books had been sold. His stories tended to be edifying, as were the periodicals he edited, Family Circle and Temple magazine. The short stories in The Adventures of Latimer Field Curate, 1903, are much more interesting to the modern taste. They are set in small towns or in country houses, and occasionally they deal with hauntings and gypsy curses. More significantly, Latimer Field was probably the first clergyman to turn to fictional sleuthing, even though most of the time his religious and theological views don't play much of a role in the investigation. Still, as Field's first case shows, Hawking could put a twist in the tale. So that one was interesting. It was about burglaries that were happening in the town. So I've got just a few stories left in Detection by Gaslight, but it's been really fun to read some Victorian short story detective fiction. I've also been continuing my read through Shirley, and I'll confess it has gotten more interesting, but I'm still just not loving it. So I think it's going to turn out to be one of those that are okay, and I'm glad that I read it, but it's never going to be my favorite unless something totally amazing happens at the end. There was, I thought, a really interesting description of Shirley. Shirley takes life easily. Is not that fact written in her eye? In her good-tempered moments, is it not as full of lazy softness as in her brief fits of anger it is fulgent with quick flashing fire? Her nature is in her eye. So long as she is calm, indolence, indulgence, humor, and tenderness possess that large gray sphere. Incense her, a red ray pierces the dew, it quickens instantly to flame. I thought that was a good description of Shirley. And then I've been continuing reading Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, and I have to confess, even though I am only just over 200 pages into this, I am loving it. I love it so much. I am so invested in the story, in the characters. It's a story about Molly Gibson, who is the daughter of the doctor in their town. But the characters are so interesting, and really like real life. And so her father remarries when she's 17, and her stepmom, Mrs. Gibson, it used to be Mrs. Kirkpatrick, is something else. Unbelievable. Like, I dislike her so much, but she is such a great character. And there was just a couple of things I noted here that I wanted to read. So there's a section where Mr. Gibson is thinking, and so far the story's written in third person omniscient, and yet there's this like parentheses sentence that seems to imply the author's not omniscient. It's so interesting. So he's been thinking about, and he says, to be sure, poor Jeannie was not so old, and how I did love her. Parentheses. Mrs. Gibson's name was Mary, so he must have been referring to someone else. I just thought that was hilarious, because as the omniscient author, shouldn't she know who that someone else is? But anyway, this edition has little footnotes that are very helpful, that explain certain things that the reader might not catch right away. But in this case, I thought it was interesting. The story refers to a novel by Walter Scott. Molly had been in the very middle of The Bride of Lammermoor, and would gladly have stayed indoors to finish it, but she felt the squire's kindness all the same. So he had come in and asked her to go out for a walk with him or something. And the footnote at the bottom, referring to Bride of Lammermoor, a novel by Walter Scott, published in 1819, that foreshadows Molly's capacity for faithfulness. So I thought it was interesting that whoever's writing these notes takes that she's reading this novel as a foreshadowing of her faithfulness. So if that's true, the author is putting a lot of assumptions in that her readers have read that novel and know that by just kind of stating that she's read that it means that she is faithful. So I thought that was, I thought that was interesting. The writer is putting a lot of faith in the knowledge of her readers. And it happens again when Mr. Gibson and Mrs. Kirkpatrick, before they are married, are discussing her daughter Cynthia. And he says, Cynthia seems to me such an out-of-the-way name, only fit for poetry, not for daily use. And there's a footnote that says, Cynthia is a name for the moon, which forebodes the character's inconstancy in love. So that, again, there's that kind of understanding or expectancy that the reader will get that, which I find interesting, because that readers at the time may, but I don't know how many modern readers would. And then finally, there is Mr. Gibson's proposal to Mrs. Kirkpatrick, which I found hilarious and so very Victorian. So they're having this discussion about their daughters, and he says, she says, you are thinking of your own daughter. It was careless of me to say what I did. Dear child, how well I remember her sweet little face as she lay sleeping on my bed. I suppose she is nearly grown up now. She must be near my Cynthia's age. How I should like to see her. I hope you will. I should like you to see her. I should like you to love my poor little Molly, to love her as your own. He swallowed down something that rose in his throat and was nearly choking him. Is he going to offer? Is he? She wondered, and she began to tremble in the suspense before he next spoke. Could you love her as your daughter? Will you try? Will you give me the right of introducing you to her as her future mother, as my wife? There, he had done it. Whether it was wise or foolish, he had done it. For he was aware that the question as to its wisdom came into his mind the instant that the words were said, past recall. So that is fascinating, but what a proposal, right? Could you love her as your daughter? Will you try? Will you give me the right of introducing you to her as her future mother, as my wife? I love this like tacked on at the end. Oh, as my wife. you know, will you marry me? But really this is more about I need a mother for my daughter. And then I've also been continuing on in Queen Victoria by Lucy Worsley, 24 Days That Changed Her Life. So I've read, I've continued on, this is still the young Victoria. Read, there was a chapter where she gets sick. But then there was this really interesting section in here about shoes, a shoemaker in the village. The shoemaker, he was selected for the honor of making Victoria's first pair of shoes. He ended up making 3 pairs, each 4 inches long, one for the baby to wear, one to keep for himself, and a third that he gave to a potter in the town to be memorialized as ceramic copies for sale. In due course, Queen Victoria would become the most merchandised monarch thus far in history, and the process had already begun. It was very interesting. Then there was a chapter on when she realized that she was the heir to the throne. So I think she's 10 or 11, and some question about when that really happened, who was there for that. So that was kind of an interesting chapter. And in that chapter, this meant that there was a basic contradiction in Victoria's position. She was, as historian Stanley Weintraub notes, clearly born into power, and those about her fought hard for her prerogatives. And yet, at the same time, she was educated, quote, by pious spinsters and cautious clergymen, end quote, exhorted to behave demurely and to live simply. Quote, it had been very early instilled into her, wrote someone who knew the adult queen well, that it was man's province to be clever and that it was best for women not to intrude into it. End quote. She was special, and yet she had to pretend to be ordinary. This strange contradiction, I believe, would in due course become the key to her surprisingly successful reign. Thought that was interesting. Then there was a chapter on 3 missing weeks in Ramsgate when she was 16. The 3 missing weeks, that refers to 3 weeks missing in her diaries because she got quite sick. And then there was the chapter on when she met Albert in 1836. And then a chapter on the day of her accession, and then the day of her coronation. So yeah, it's been really interesting, and I think that Lucy Worsley has chosen, so of these 24 days that changed her life, she's chosen days that you would certainly expect, you know, the day she was born, the day that she found out she was going to be queen, and the day that she was coronated, but then she also, the day of her coronation. But then she also includes certain other days that I find very interesting, but that certainly changed her life, and that kind of made her into the queen that she became. So yeah, I've been really enjoying this, and if I don't finish it this month, I will just continue it next month, and it will totally count for Nonfiction November. So that's what I've been reading this past week. I'm hoping to finish Wives and Daughters this month, as well as Shirley and the Victorian Detective Stories. And if I can do that, then I will feel like I had a very, very successful Victober. So what are your thoughts on these books? Have you read any of these books? I would love to chat with you in the comment section down below, and I will see you for another video soon. Bye.